Okay, it's right on the dot, time to start. 10 o'clock. Welcome to class. If you want to turn your Bibles to John chapter 2, that's where we're going to be this morning. Might go a little bit backwards into John chapter 1, but we're not going to go outside of that. Let's begin this morning with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity you've given us to come together and to study from your word and to learn about your Son. Pray that as we enter into this study, we'll have open hearts and a willingness to examine Jesus' life. And we know that we are followers of his, and we want to do what he did and be like he was. And give us a willingness to mold our lives to his, and to not hold on and cling on to those things that we maybe hold dear in this life, but to have eternal perspective and know that, again, this world is not our home, but we look forward to the home in eternity with you when our lives are over. We're thankful for Jesus' life that was perfect and that sacrifice that he made so that we can be redeemed from our sins. Be with all those other teachers that are in the classes and give them the ability to remember the things that they prepared, and help us all, again, to have an open and honest approach to your word and a willingness to change ourselves to conform to be like you and your Son. So in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so John chapter 2, we're going to talk about Jesus' first miracle. So it's the beginning, right? I mean, so if you were here at the very early on, and I know this probably doesn't run at the best time because people are socializing and few people look at it, but if we look at the timeline of Jesus, we're like right at the beginning. In reality, he's 30 years old, so he's lived most of his life, but as far as his life as we know it, we're at the very beginning of it. And this is where you want to say, like, this is his coming out party. This is not his coming out party. This is just the first miracle that he performs, and we're going to get into that. I don't want to belabor that too much. But it says in verse 1 of chapter 2, on the third day. Well, on the third day, what does that mean? The third day from what? And that means you need to go backwards in order to really understand. So let's look a little bit into context and what we've looked at so far. We remember that we've looked at Jesus' baptism. And John doesn't record Jesus' baptism, but we know that the other Gospels do. So Jesus has been baptized by John the Baptizer. We know that directly from that event, remember the Spirit came down upon him like a dove. Directly after that, the Spirit took him into the wilderness, and he was fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and he was tempted by Satan, and he passed through that. And directly after that, this seems where John picks up. In John chapter 1, we look at in verse 29 is the section, and so John is in the Jordan area, the River Jordan area, in the wilderness. This is where he lives. This is where he eats his locusts and wild honey. And he's baptizing. And people are coming to him from Jerusalem, coming to him from all over the place to be baptized. And the Jews had a major problem with that, although they got in line to be baptized as well. So John's baptized, and Jesus goes and gets baptized. He's carried off. He comes back. At this point, John sees him and declares, he makes witness to him, behold, the Lamb of God takes away the sin of the world. And directly after that, so John has a following. John's got followers, and we know that these followers it's not just a handful, there's quite a few, because we see them throughout the beginning of Jesus' ministry, talk to Jesus. In fact, when John makes that declaration about Jesus, two of his disciples just dropped what they were doing with John and followed Jesus. And we know that one of them was Andrew, and I put a question mark for the other because it doesn't get there. He's not named, but we understand it to be John, the son of Zebedee, the author of the book of John. At least that's what I understand it to be. If you have a different opinion, you're certainly welcome to it. I can't prove you wrong, and you can't prove me right, or I can't. You know what I'm saying? So now Jesus has two disciples directly after this declaration that John makes, and that's if we count. Right now we're counting in days. We're not counting in months or years. We're counting in days. So if this was day 1 of the time we're starting to count, so John makes this declaration, the disciples begin to follow him. The next day, he goes and calls Philip, and I want to digress a little bit. So Andrew joins Jesus after John's declaration. And John, and then Andrew goes and gets his brother, and most likely John gets his brother. They were all of the same trade, they had relation. They knew. It seems that they knew each other before this. Certainly, John and Andrew did, and so we know that Andrew goes and gets Simon. Jesus tells him he's going to be named Peter, be called Peter, and so he's got 4 or 3, probably 4 disciples at this point. The next day, so this is day 2, he goes and calls Andrew, and Andrew goes and gets Nathaniel. Here, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew is what I know. See, I memorized the disciples when I was a little kid, so I'm going over the order. Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, and then Bartholomew, which is also Nathaniel. So Philip goes and gets Nathaniel, and remember, Jesus says to Nathaniel, hey, I saw you under the tree. And Nathaniel's like, whoa, you are the Messiah. And Jesus then says to him, which is my favorite line, you haven't seen anything yet, is basically what he says to him at the end of chapter 2, or end of chapter 1. So at this point, we got Peter, Andrew, James, or John, James probably, Philip, and Bartholomew / Nathaniel. So 6 guys, 5 or 6 guys, depending on how you want to look at it, are following Jesus at this point. And we're talking days. So there was 2 days, day 2. This is 3 days after, this is the 3rd day after which Jesus talked to Nathaniel. So we're looking at day 5 or 6. We could debate whether it was 5 or 6. Doesn't really matter. They've only known Jesus for a short amount of time. A very, very short amount of time. Yet they followed him. They dropped everything. And they're following Jesus. And Jesus, let's see, I have another. And his disciples walk to Cana. So Cana is there's not much to mention about Cana. It's a hillside village. If we go back to this slide, this is a old picture of what Cana was, just a hillside village. And this is where they walked to. That wasn't a picture from Jesus' time, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to insinuate that at all. It was just an old picture. But Cana is just a hillside village. They walk, it's about 8 miles to the north and a little bit to the east of Nazareth. We see if you go to John chapter 21, John says this is actually where Nathaniel's from. And other than that, nothing happens, nothing biblical, no account in the Bible mentions Cana. And we call it Cana of Galilee because there's actually a Cana that's not super far away, but it's actually Cana of what they'd say Syria. But there's probably Canas throughout this whole area. So this is Cana of Galilee. And so they go to a wedding feast. So a couple things interesting to keep in mind. So they go up to this wedding feast. Jesus is invited, and Jesus' disciples are invited with him. I think I have my next slide. So there were clearly people that knew Jesus that were getting married. They knew his mother because his mother was at the feast. And I think a little bit of sidebar when it says in chapter 1 or chapter 2, it says that Jesus' mother was also there in verse 1. This is a very good indication that John was definitely written after, was post, if not all of the other gospels, certainly at least some of them. John doesn't mention Mary by name. The assumption is that John's not calling her Mary because they know whom Jesus' mother is at this point. If you're reading it and don't have a personal relationship didn't have a personal relationship with Jesus, the readers of these gospels would know that Jesus' mother is Mary. And so Mary is there. It seems like she's involved. So this is a wedding feast. We've all been to a wedding or part of a wedding or either the bride or groom in a wedding. All of us in this audience. I don't think there's any little kids that hadn't been to a wedding yet. But we've all been to a wedding. I have to say that these weddings in Jewish culture are not necessarily like our wedding. There's some parts that are similar, like you have a bride and a groom, and you have a ceremony. But other than that, it was more of a holiday. It was more of I wouldn't call it a feast, but it lasted multiple days. So it would occur something like this. So the wedding itself would happen in the evening. The actual formal ceremony would happen in the evening, and then the bride and groom would be paraded through the town, something like this, with torches because it's at night, and everyone would greet them. And the commentary read, it seems like they picked the longest street in whatever town or village, the longest corridor, maybe they didn't necessarily have streets per se, so that they can get as much interaction with the people of the village as possible. So if there were those that were not at the wedding proper. They were definitely greeting the bride and groom as they end the wedding party as it paraded through town. And then after that, they go back to their home, and this is where the whole 7-day feast comes into play. You have a feast, but it's more of an open house for the bride and groom. They're at their home, and they have people coming in and going out all week long and really showering them with gifts. And what somebody said was they're treated like a king and queen for that week. And so it's, rather than have what we do is we go away for a week-ish, maybe, if you're lucky when you get married, into some exotic location where you don't know anybody, and nobody knows that you're married or not, and nobody bothers you. Here, there's people coming in all the time. They're coming in, staying with you, and leaving, potentially coming back the next day, or maybe staying the whole time. I mean, in that culture, they were very close. In our culture, I don't know how well it would fly because, you get, okay, I've seen you enough times. Maybe that's just my cynical take on it. But there's people there all the time, and the community is heavily involved in the celebration of this. And so it seems Mary is acquainted with the people, or at least one side of the family, one of the families that's involved in this marriage. She was very interested in it being successful. We'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. And they knew Jesus and invited Jesus. And it's also important to look at, sometimes we see Jesus and maybe sometimes his disciples as people that were kind of stoic or maybe rigid, didn't laugh or enjoy themselves. It was very, they lived the harsh life, slept on stones. We were, and the only good things that you can get in life are bad things, kind of situation. But that was not Jesus. That was not the character of Jesus. And we can see one of his first acts as, being a rabbi of followers is to go to a feast and to go to a celebration and to be involved in it. The person that stands out the most at a feast is the person that's not involved in it. So Jesus would have been like anybody else at this feast. And I go back to Luke chapter 2 and verse 52 when it says, Jesus grew in stature and in favor with God and with man. So Jesus made friends. Jesus made connections. And here we see through his family, Jesus was also invited. There's a chance that this could have been a relative of Jesus, but it's unimportant. And we see it there at the end. We don't know who the bride and groom are, and so therefore we know that it was unimportant to the purpose of this event, who was actually getting married. But we do see also, Jesus supports marriage. This is not Jesus going to the wedding feast and being does anybody, how we like to say, if anybody sees why these two shouldn't be joined, this isn't Jesus standing up and saying, no, I disagree, no one should get married. We should be single. That's how life should be. Jesus supports the marriage. In fact, we see that God created the relationship between man and woman in marriage, and Jesus is supporting it here. Any comments about marriages, wedding feasts in this time that you might have a little tidbit of info that would enlighten the class? Okay, so Jesus goes to the party. He is with his disciples, and we don't know how much time has passed, at what point well, we know it's into the party, into the wedding feast, and we know that there have been more people and more people coming than there was anticipated by the party planners, than by the families, and they were running out of wine. They were going to run out. And in this culture, that's kind of it would be certainly, we'd say, oh, well, people get over it. That's not how it works around here. Again, another commentator said that, in this culture, if you're bringing a commitment of a gift to the wedding, you have an expectation that it's going to be reciprocated back in, you're going to be fed, and you're going to get what you need in order to be sustained, and you're going to have an enjoyable time. If any of those things are not met, then there could be actions taken against those that are throwing the wedding. So not only would it be like in social circles, would it be seen as a horrible thing and how you let everybody down, but if I brought an expensive gift and I didn't get a drink or any food, I can send them a bill. something along those lines. And so everyone knew it was a big deal. Clearly, Mary thought it was very important, and she saw Jesus as the solution to the problem. So it's still pretty ambiguous what exactly Mary was expecting. Clearly, I don't think she was saying, you have enough disciples to go run out and get as much wine as you can find and bring it back. She was anticipating Jesus would do something, but as it says at the end of this account, this was the first sign that Jesus did. Mary had never seen Jesus perform a miracle. No one had seen Jesus perform a miracle. Mary did have the advantage of that she had remembered in her heart many of the things that she had seen, like Gabriel coming and talking to her, and Jesus and her having a child without having relations with a man. And so she knew things about Jesus and seeing him in the temple. Remember these events that we know about. Mary obviously hadn't experienced them. And so she knew Jesus was different, but she also knew he was a very good person. And maybe she thought he was ingenious. Maybe she thought he could come up with a solution that she couldn't come up with. But she went straight to Jesus. So I do want to talk a little bit about the wine, because we're talking about a party and talking about wine, and we'll just cover this quickly. If you have comments, you're willing to, or you're more than open to make them. But so the Greek word here is talking about, it's a term that's used to describe, it could describe grape juice and wine. It would be similar to what we call cider. As if you had cider, you could have hard cider. Sometimes we put hard cider because it has alcoholic content, and you could just say regular cider. But this is the same thing, this word oinos. So it could be talking about fermented or unfermented wine, or unfermented fruit from the grapes, or juice from the grapes. And also, at this time, the alcoholic content was very small. 5 to 8%, whereas today modern wines is like 18-ish% on average. And not only that, but remember, we're talking about a poor community, so anything that you have is going to be expanded in order to last longer. This is a poor example, but when I was a kid, my parents would take us out to lunch on Sundays. And I remember we'd get one Coke. Now every time you get a Coke, you can have unlimited refills. I feel old. Back in my day, you only got one cup of it. And we got one cup of it. I remembered I wanted it to last really long, so I'd drink part of it and then I'd put water in it to make it last longer. It definitely is affected when you put water into it. And that's the same here. In order to extend or increase the volume of fluid that you have, they added water to it, which cut down the bite of the wine itself. And certainly drunkenness is condemned. Even in this time, drunkenness was frowned upon, was punishable. Obviously, God has been very clear about drunkenness, but yet when we talk about the master of the party, or the toastmaster, or the coordinator, when the good wine, ultimately, spoiler alert, when the good wine is brought to him that Jesus makes, he says, everybody's already been drinking freely. Well, this hasn't turned into some kind of drunken party. So it was implied there that what they're getting is not something that's going to, if you drink freely, it's not going to knock you off your feet. And then lastly, distilled liquor wasn't discovered or invented until way further down the road. Yeah, I think that when I think of new wine, I think of the new wine and the old wineskins when it talks about the expansion of it, and I think that's the fermenting. The new wine is not fermented yet, or not fully fermented. Any comments? Awesome. Okay, so Mary goes to Jesus and says, they're running out of wine. And you'll see here that it says they've run out of wine, but I do, looking at the way that through the Greek, it's more that she's saying that they are very close to running out, or they don't have enough wine, is maybe a better translation of it. And Jesus' response is, what does it have to do with me? Yeah, what do you, in my terms, what do you want from me? Because in truth, Mary has never seen Jesus do anything miraculous. Why she would think now that he could or would, I don't know, but it was important. I think the situation warranted her to be upset and to seek the only answer that they could find. Up to this point, if you're running low on wine, go get some wine from the neighbor. I would expect that all of those have been exhausted. There was no real recourse. It's nighttime, more than likely. There's not much they can do to solve this problem. I'm sure that the master of the party was probably at wit's end, thinking that there's not going to be enough wine and that aggression is going to be pointed towards him. So Mary goes to Jesus and says, "This is important. I need you to help." Well, you see that Jesus puts the situation into the proper perspective. Mary's thinking about this physical problem, and I need a physical solution right now. And Jesus wasn't ready. Jesus was not there. Jesus, first off, I think, is dealing with her approaching him in general in this manner and saying, "Why are you doing this now?" And then he says, "My hour is not yet come." So he certainly points towards God and says, this is God's time. God controls whether I'm going to do whatever he's going to do is on God's clock, not on man's. So if somebody were to request him to do something, if God's timing was in line with that, then Jesus would do it. But clearly it's not right here. So I think that does imply some things. I do think that implies that I don't think Jesus is saying, I'm not ready to start my ministry yet, because he has started it already. He started it when he called his disciples. I think that probably he's declaring that he's not ready to show everyone, because we can see that he does this discreetly. Yeah? What?
He wasn't ready to go up.
Yeah, and I think that also too, I think it's more of that it's not God's timing. If God's timing was that whatever it was, if he was ready to go and show the world, then if it was God's timing that it was time, he would have done it. But I think too, what lines up with this is that it's not time to do this miracle yet. I mean, we'll see that Jesus could have just said that the water, it's right there, the wine's right there, without doing anything. Also something to think about, if they're running low on wine and Jesus replenishes the wine, then it could just be assumed by those that observe this. I want to go spoiler alert and say at the end, the purpose of this miracle is for his followers. It's for his disciples. That is the purpose of this miracle. And so the wine's running down. If it's not completely depleted and some more comes, there's an easy explanation. Well, they had more than they thought, or they found some extra. So once the wine is depleted and there's no further supply, then Jesus is going to make it happen. And we'll see what Jesus does. So God's timing is what drives Jesus, or what dictates when Jesus does what he does. When he turns his face to Jerusalem and knows that he's going to die, it's based on God's timing. Remember this as we go through this class and we look at Jesus' life. He does mention, and there are, I'll say a handful, maybe 8 times that Jesus says, "This is not my hour has not yet come." He's referring to God's timeline. God has determined when Jesus' life was going to take the courses it does, and Jesus knew when that was, and Jesus followed that as an obedient servant. But then you'll see, so if I heard Jesus, if I'm reading this or if I hear this and I'm Mary, you're like, okay, well, he's not going to do anything. He's saying it's not time. He's not ready. But Mary's response to her servants is, do whatever he says. So Mary had faith. Mary had faith that he was going to do something to help this situation. And we'll see in the end, nobody really notices except for his disciples. Even the people, as far as we know, there was no real following that Jesus garnered because of this action at the moment. So there's a lot of either, oh, it's not a big deal, or not really comprehending what happened. But I think, again, the purpose is served in the end. So Mary tells Mary tells the servants at the wedding feast, do whatever he says. Be prepared to do whatever. She didn't know what he was going to do. So she had to be prepared for whatever. So they asked for 6 pots. Jesus asked for 6 pots. They gathered the 6 pots, and the specific kind of pots. You guys notice what kind of pots are these? What are they for? They're for the washings. So they're, in Jewish culture, again, they wash all of the time. They wash their hands, they wash their feet, they wash almost everything. And these are pots that are going to hold multiple gallons. I say it was like 20 gallons a piece, 20 to 30 gallons a piece. And they're normally filled with water. These are not wine-carrying devices. These are things that are set up that are usually filled with water for people to wash their hands and whatnot in. So Jesus calls for these, and you notice the subtlety of this miracle and the power demonstrated in it, in that Jesus tells them, fill them up, and they fill them to the brim, to the point where there's no room to fill any more water. And then he says, take a cup of it to the wedding coordinator, I'll call him for lack of a better term. Take a cup of it to the wedding coordinator. So they dip. Again, these servants don't know anything other than what they've been tasked to do. Mary told them to do it. Jesus told them to do it. They did it. Took it to the master of the feast, or the coordinator. And then let's look at what his response was. And we're going to look in verse 9. When the master of the feast tasted the water that had now become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and then people have drunk freely, then the poor wine, but you have kept the good wine until now. So the result is an insight into not only Jesus' ability to control the physical, but also the quality. Like not only the transformation of water into wine, it was also the ability to dictate the level or the quality of it. And so this coordinator says, hey, why are you waiting to save the good stuff when people are going to have already had their fill? Now they're going to drink it, and you're not going to get the benefit of having that quality wine. When you first drink it, I'm not a coffee drinker, but I know if you drink a hot cup of coffee versus a lukewarm cup of coffee, there's a big difference. I think that this would be analogous to that. Drinking your first cup of this wine, and it's at a certain level, and then say 5 cups later, you get the good stuff. Are you really going to be able to tell the difference, that it was the good stuff or the same stuff? And I think the point is, they're not going to tell the difference. And they aren't going to know anything different happened. And I think they're going to go through this wedding feast and think, oh, it's a regular wedding feast. Nothing special happened. It does show that the servants knew that Jesus had done something, but they hadn't tasted the wine. They knew it was water when they poured it in, and now that the coordinator is saying, hey, this is good stuff, to the bridegroom. I wonder what the bridegroom's answer was. He would have been lost. I don't know. I'm just here to get married. That's what would have been my answer. And so they go on. The water had been turned to wine. Again, it's very subtle, and it's no pomp and no circumstance. You think about what we call modern day, like the healers and the charismatic people that want to put on a show. We all know it's fake and show, but here Jesus is doing something so powerful, but he did nothing other than to say, fill that up. They followed. And when I think about it, I think of Naaman too. When Jesus tells Naaman, you're going to go dip into the Jordan River and you're going to be clean. And Naaman's like, wow, is Naaman right? I think Naaman's the right name. And he balked and said, I don't want it. That's too dirty. Send me up to the nice rivers up north, and I'll dip there gladly. But really, all it took is 7 times, and he was cleansed. It was nothing. It was the act of obedience and Jesus' power that cleansed him. And I see here, that's the same idea. You're not going to see lightning bolts, and you're not going to see, explosions or mighty voices, or hear mighty voices. It's very subtle. Jesus has the power to control the physical, and not only just the physical, but the quality level of the physical. So it's like 2 dynamics going on there, and Jesus is able to control for both. Any comments? Okay, so Jesus has transmuted, I don't know, whatever you want to say, has changed this water to wine, and a high quality wine. And then in chapter 2, verse 11 says, "This is the first sign Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him." So again, these guys that have known Jesus for a week at best-ish, maybe a little bit less than a week, have given up their lives, put everything down. What they've gone on is the strength of Jesus' message, the conviction, the passion that what Jesus has spoke, the truth to them, the truth with which John really imparted and spoke with passion again about Jesus. Remember, he is the one preparing the way for Jesus, preparing the path for Jesus. Based on those two men's words, these 5 or 6 guys have dropped everything and followed. And now that faith that they demonstrated in following has been confirmed or verified by this act that Jesus has. Remember, we go back to John 20 and 30 and 31. What was the purpose of the book of John? You guys remember?
Truly many other signs have been in the presence of the disciples.
Well,
These were done that you might believe that he is the Christ, and believing you might have life in him.
so belief is the purpose. So John records this, and no other gospel records this, but this was done in order to bolster his disciples that he had, small following. He's got less than half of what he's going to ultimately have as his called, as his close group. Sorry, I got another slide. Oh, we'll get there in a second. So this was done in order to really to confirm to them Jesus is what he says he is. What Jesus says we need to do. Look at these servants that did what Jesus said, and the result is the impossible became possible. Going back to, just remember, just a couple days earlier, what did Jesus say to Bartholomew/Nathaniel? You were impressed when I said I saw you under the tree. You're going to see things that you can't even imagine. Yeah, Jim.
You made a comment just a minute ago that this miracle was designed and aimed at the disciples. And if you think about some of the early miracles when they were in the ship on the sea, and some of the other miracles, they were basically targeted towards his disciples.
Sure. And I think that there's a very, very good reason for that. I mean, these are going to be the guys that ultimately are going to give their lives for Jesus. But I think that what I think it demonstrates is if you're faithful and you follow Jesus, you're going to see, and things are going to happen in your life. Even today, we don't see miracles, but we are going to see providence. We're going to see a lot of things happen in our life where we say, God is clearly working in my life. Things are happening that are positive, are working for the cause of Christ. And I think that faith is rewarded. I think that's another thing that we can take away from this. If we follow Christ's lead, then we will be successful. And again, it doesn't have to necessarily mean physical success. I don't want to imply that. I think there is a level of physical success oftentimes that we get from God, but really ultimately our goal is, and this was what Mary struggled with. Mary was thinking physical when she said, Jesus, do something. She was thinking, take care of this situation. We're going to see Jesus is going to start saying, oh, ye of little faith, or they didn't see the true purpose of the Messiah. Remember, in context, the Jews are looking for, and Mary is looking for, because she does not understand, she's looking for Jesus to stand up and to declare and to create a nation of God's people and to kick the Romans out and to elevate the Jewish nation. That was, even his followers, I mean, that's what they were taught from their birth, that this is what the Messiah was. You look back at, what is the guy's name, that the old guy that came to baby Jesus in the temple? I just looked at that the other day. Simon. He understood. He looked at the prophecies, and he understood what all of the prophecies lined up meant. And that's why when he saw Jesus, he saw what Jesus was. He was the Messiah that was going to deliver his people, but also all people from their sins. So I think I got one last verse in my section. So after this, Jesus performs his first miracle. He decides where he's going to set up. We call his base. He goes to Capernaum. He decides that, hey, this is where he does a lot of his work. It's where he sends his disciples out from, and they come back to some interesting things about Capernaum. Clearly, it's on the Sea of Galilee. Peter has a house there. There's a synagogue there. And he's going to call Matthew from there in not very long. And if there's no other comments or questions, we're right on time.